Much for taking the time to join us. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us once again. And please feel free to ask questions. You can type in the questions. And I'm going to turn it over now to my able colleague, Professor Nathaniel Maltis, who is going to, of course, introduce our esteemed professor for this event. Once again, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Okoro. It's very good to be with you today, and we are very honored to have as our guest Professor Constance Hilliard. Professor Hilliard pioneered the field of genomic history as a critical aspect of 21st century precision medicine. Her research has opened the door to overlooked avenues of prevention regarding such high-risk disorders in Blacks as salt-sensitive hypertension, chronic kidney disease, and TRPV6 expressing, that is, metastatic prostate and triple-negative breast cancer. In 2024, Harvard University Press identified her work in identifying disease-triggering gene variants in West African populations as groundbreaking. She is a professor of genomic history, Emerita, at the University of North Texas, with a Ph.D. in historiography from Harvard University. And I want to just before I ask you to welcome her, tell you that her talk is going to be about 40 minutes, and ask you to please, during the talk, place your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. There's a button for it at the bottom of the screen, and I will help moderate the questions for our speaker. And finally, I would ask those of you who are here from Africana, if you're an Africana students, to just say hello in the chat. And if you are a Binghamton faculty, also say hello in the chat. And please do join me in welcoming Professor Constance Hilliard. Professor Hilliard, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Matthews. And also thank you, Dr. Okuror, for this wonderful invitation. I'm very excited and I look forward to interacting with your audience. Today I'm going to be talking about certain public health factors that play a very significant role in African American health, but that have been essentially overlooked. And what I want to look at specifically are several issues relating to what is meant by ancestral genomics. This is the field that I worked on over the course of the last 15 years, and it has major significance as it relates to precision medicine in the 21st century. And what I mean by that is simply the fact that there are many diseases that have fortunately found cures. And there are then those that haven't as we've moved into this new century. But the difference is that oftentimes the diseases that really have been grappled with successfully tend to have a fairly universal value in the sense that, everybody can get a headache or problems with their stomach or problems with various issues in organs. But when we're dealing with 21st century medicine, we're dealing on a level that is much more specific and much more localized. And the symptoms may appear to be the same, but you will see from what I'm talking about that the paradigm has to be fundamentally different. Okay, and then the second aspect of what I'm going to be talking about, of course, relates to the first, but it helps us to understand a problem. And the problem is that the precision medicine that has developed up until this point, it is focused on European populations. And I've already used this word localized because what I mean by that is simply the fact that people of Northern European ancestry will have certain gene variants that people of Eastern European ancestry don't have, or Mediterranean ancestry. Well, certainly there will be gene variants that populations of African ancestry have that these other populations don't have. And what becomes so critical is for us to be able to differentiate populations, not by race, but in other ways that relate to the ecological environment to which people are adapted. Okay, so I'm going to be looking particularly at certain diseases in African Americans that are actually preventable, for which the prevention protocols have been overlooked. And they've been overlooked because the paradigms that were used in public health and medicine are not sufficiently up to date and not sufficiently cognizant of what is needed if we're going to deal not just with the health of people of European ancestry, but everybody's health. So, case study A recognizes the fact that there are 750,000 African Americans today on dialysis, suffering from, and I just emphasize over and over again this word, preventable APOL1-mediated kidney disease, chronic kidney disease, but it's a very specific form. Okay, and we will be really delving into what is really going on here and what do you mean it's preventable if, in fact, not only do we have such a large number of African Americans on dialysis, but the story gets worse because we have 11,000 Black people who die every year from APOL1-mediated kidney disease. We call it AMKD. And case study B will be looking and using the same paradigm to recognize the fact that there is an issue whereby African American women who are suffering from triple negative breast cancer um, have a very, very high, sadly, mortality rate, whereas women suffering from what they call BRCA breast cancers, they've been very fortunate because the 21st century medicine, precision medicine paradigm has focused so much attention on BRCA that there are these breakthroughs that are really helping women who otherwise would not have made it through survive these cancers. But this is not the case for African American women suffering from triple negative, and I'll go into details there. Okay, I'm a genomic historian, and what that really essentially says is that I'm sort of a detective and investigator looking for health and medical clues in ancestral populations, in ancestral genetic populations, or what we might, in more modern terms, call genomic populations. Now, the question you might ask is, well, why? Why is this necessary? Why is a historian meddling in these medical issues? And I will explain it very easily in a sense. In 2003, um, we were fortunate to see the launch of the Human Genome Project, and it was very, very exciting. But it didn't take long before we began to realize that there were some real serious issues here. The goal was to identify diseases at the genetic level so that, given the fact that humans have 22,000 genes, and actually sometimes between 19 and 22,000, depending on which genetic scientist you talk to, but I'll just say the 22,000. The whole point was, wow, if we connect the gene to the particular disorder that people are suffering from, then we'll be able to use uh, uh, pharmacology or pharmacological ways of really getting at these diseases. But it turned out that that wasn't so easy. Nature has a way of throwing curveballs, to say the least. Okay, in 2003, researchers were beginning to note more and more and more variations on these 22,000 genes. And when I say variations, I'm just going to make this up, but you have gene A, B, C, D, and then you have B, C, D, and D, C, A, and with little numbers and all kinds of things. But what it really means is that there will be slight variations, even though it really is the same gene. Well, here comes the problem. Between 2003 and 2025, it turned out no, there weren't 2 million of these things, these variants. There were 335 million. Yeah, 335 million variations. Disease triggers are identified through variations, not for the most part through which of the 22,000 genes could be causing something. And there are a few diseases that are caused by genes, but most diseases that we're now struggling with, and most cancers and chronic diseases and all kinds of things, it's a matter of the particular gene variant. The particular gene variant. Okay, so there is another aspect of the problem, and that is the fact that precision medicine has made some very significant breakthroughs, but those breakthroughs, in most cases, have only benefited people of European ancestry. And the reason is because you can look at this particular chart and see fairly readily that 78.39% of the individuals who were being investigated in terms of their genomics, their genomic profiles, and the genomic sequencing of, within their bodies, were European. And then there are various others. And then you get to African, it's 2.03% have been of the gene variants found in Africans have been sequenced. And what that really, really means is that gene variants that are triggering diseases in populations of African descent, well, they're not going to be identified. They're not even going to be researched because there is not enough data available since they're not focused upon, So here, I'd like to start with what I call case study A. But before I do so, I also want to make a certain clarification. And what I mean is that the term diversity has two primarily different connotations, and yet it's a primary issue in this particular subject, so I want to offer some clarification. When we're talking about a classroom full of students, and some of the students are white, and some are black, and some are Latino, and some are Native American, and some are Asian, and so forth and so on, we're using the term diversity. And oftentimes, in even talking about medical research, the term diversity is used to make sure that you have representation from different populations, so forth and so on. But I'm here to tell you that there's another connotation of the word diversity, and it's profoundly different. That is genetic diversity. And sometimes genetic diversity is referred to as genetic variation. But here we have what is, in a way, an almost explosive situation. Because what is genetic diversity? Genetic diversity identifies the number of gene variants within an organism, the number of different gene variants. But remember what I said earlier. Where are the gene variants in the human species? The largest number of gene variants are on the African continent. This is because Africa is not just our human homeland, so forth and so on, and then people migrated out. There's a whole lot more to it. It is just that the pan-human genome is still in Africa. It's still there. And the populations that migrated out of Africa, even though everybody shares the same number of genes, gene variants are so much more localized that as populations break away from one another, you end up having fewer and fewer gene variants the further you get from Africa. So back to this classroom example I was giving. So we'd have this classroom with people from different places, and we say, oh, yeah, we've got diversity. We have ethnic diversity and cultural diversity and social diversity. But if you look at that same class and you're asking for genetic diversity, the genetic diversity is only going to be in the Africans. Okay. Okay, so now as we move on, and hopefully I'm creating an environment where some questions might arise. So I apologize if I'm just kind of zipping through some of these areas. Okay, so what is APOL1-mediated kidney disease? I had earlier mentioned that it's a very, very, very serious problem for African Americans. And uh, I can reiterate this horrible statistic of 750,000 being on dialysis, and the fact that so many African Americans die every year from this particular form of chronic kidney disease. Now, in terms of kidney disease, there are various kinds, and I must say I'm no expert, except that I certainly know a great deal about. This is called AMKD, but there are zero whites who suffer from AMKD, and the reason that is the case relates to this field of genomic history that I've worked on for so many years. The G1 and G2 variants of the APOL1 gene, they are the disease triggers for AMKD. If you have either two G1s, two G2s, or a G1, G2, you're going to end up with this disease and you're going to end up on dialysis and so forth and so on. But um, but why is it that not only Africans, it's not just West Africans, it is West Africans from the deep interior of West Africa. And this is where the history part becomes so critical to understand because medical researchers didn't make the connection. They saw G1 and G2 in West Africa, but they weren't looking carefully enough to see where in West Africa. The ancestors of Black Americans came from the deep interior of West Africa. This region is one of the most sodium deficient regions in the world. And I'll say it again. This region is one of the most sodium deficient regions in the world. The significance of that is the fact that the peasant farmers who lived there for however many thousands of years, they had to their bodies had to become adapted to an extremely low sodium environment, even though they're farming in the sweltering heat of West Africa, and it gets really darn hot in West Africa. Well, they were adapted, and that's what G1 and G2 are all about. That's the function of these gene variants. These are gene variants that are so much more absorptive of sodium that it allows certain human populations to survive in an extremely low sodium environment. The peasant farmers in this region had never tasted table salt. No. They flavored their food with potassium chloride, which was derived from burnt millet leaves. And I'll say this one thing about potassium chloride. In having done this research, here I try to, put some potassium chloride on my food, but it tastes like metal filings. I mean, my point being that you have to be you have to live in an environment and grow up with certain tastes and so forth. The problem in America is that our sodium levels are so extremely high in sodium in the salt, it's highly addictive. So I am here to tell you that what I'm talking about is African Americans really lowering their sodium level. But I'm here to tell you that it's not an easy thing, and I would really pat you on the back if you can just, pour some potassium chloride over your food because it takes some getting used to. Okay, but now let's move on. Um, on the other hand, coastal West Africans, like Europeans, are genetically accustomed to consuming between 3,000 and 5,000 milligrams of sodium today. My ancestors, as an African American of slave descent, lived on less than 500 milligrams of sodium. And remember, I said they had never even tasted table salt. They're getting their sodium from the vegetables and the meat they're eating, and yeah, so forth and so on. So, what we have is a situation where it's dangerous to think in terms of race because we're not able to differentiate populations that are genetically adapted to different environments. The reason coastal West Africans have a similar sodium intake to Europeans is because they're on the coast, and salt is practically free when you're on the Atlantic coast or the coast of any ocean. And so you will find all coastal populations on this planet consuming very high levels of salt. But you will not find coastal Africans carrying the G1 and G2 variants of the APOL1 gene. They carry what's called the G0 variant. Okay. Um, but then the question that very readily came to my mind was how is it possible that American textbooks would essentially say that human beings could not survive on less than 500 milligrams of sodium a day? And the point is that the humanity and the physiology of Europeans is normalized within American medicine. It's normalized in the sense that whatever we are accustomed to seeing in terms of people of European origin, we make the presumption that this is human. These are the limitations of humans without realizing that different populations come from diverse environments. Okay, so I'll just tell you something quickly about the model I put together. I call it the ecological niche population model, but honestly, it's third grade arithmetic because I'm a historian. I kind of simplify things. The point being that, oh, if you want to have some idea of what's a good sodium intake, for yourself, and you've already spent $99 on one of those ancestry DNA tests or whatever. Actually, they're not always so helpful because they're not differentiating populations the way we are. But in any case, um, we can, for instance, look at the fact that African Americans of slave descent, and I'll say sadly because of sexual slavery, which is not something mentioned in the textbooks, but essentially that's the form of slavery that existed in America. Um, Generally speaking, African Americans of slave descent have maybe 75% West African DNA, 25% Northern European, um, and and so forth and so on. But um, those numbers can vary very significantly, but it's the categories that don't vary. And I remember having students sometimes I'd be in my office and the phone would ring and it would be some student and it would be a female and she'd be sort of weeping and yeah, yeah. And I always knew what it was. What it was they would have spent their $99 and found their ancestry, and it turned out that the reason some of the family members or cousins had light skin and wavy hair, it wasn't because of Cherokee ancestors, it was because of their Northern European ancestry. So this is how we know it was sexual slavery. Yeah. But in any case, the point is that if interior West Africans are consuming 200 to 500 milligrams of sodium, we can at least get a sense of, well, if my ancestry is 75% West African and whatever, you can just do the third grade arithmetic, and that's what that's all about. Okay. Um, Sadly, sodium has been the overlooked clue. And this was something that really startled me at first because I couldn't quite understand why there wasn't an extraordinary amount of focus on the issue of sodium. But one thing I figured out immediately was the imagery of slavery and the fact that without having any precise knowledge or understanding of the fact that the people who were enslaved were marched 1,000 miles from the interior to the coast. They were not coastal West Africans, okay? But when you see people being uploaded onto the slave ships and so forth, you can't help but think, well, obviously they're on the coast and there's obviously a lot of free salt in the ocean and so forth and so on. So why should salt be an issue? And as a consequence, it was just totally overlooked, totally overlooked. Well, the point I'm making here is that you can go back and do research on G1 and G2 because there's been research on the functionality of it. But the problem was that actual genetic research showing that G1 and G2 are highly absorptive of sodium and highly retentive of sodium. That research was just ignored, and it was ignored because with this imagery of African American slave ships, the Atlantic coast, nobody could see how sodium had any impact or any meaning. It's because, of course, they had no understanding of West African history, because in fact, when I started college, there was no such thing as African history or African studies. In fact, the chairman of Harvard's history department actually told me that it would have been a waste of time because Africa didn't have a history. This is what we're dealing with. Okay, so in any case, it turns out that there was research on dealing with sodium, but it was just set aside because nobody felt that it was relevant to anything. Um, so here we have um, certain issues for which the research has been done, but it wasn't really attended to. Now, let me just go back to say a few things about these AMKD diseases because they are very serious, very, very serious. In every single one of these diseases listed here, these are the AMKD diseases. The initiating disease is salt-sensitive hypertension. The initiating disease is salt-sensitive hypertension. Now, that is not to say that everybody with salt-sensitive hypertension, and most African Americans over the age of 55 have salt-sensitive hypertension, 75%, but it's not as though everybody's going to end up with one of these diseases. Focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, lupus nephritis, membranous nephropathy, nephrotic syndrome, HIV-associated nephropathy, and preeclampsia leading to childbirth mortality. All of them lead to kidney failure, okay? Yeah. But the issue is that, well, why wasn't this put together? And the primary reason that I sort of figured out was a misunderstanding relating to the role sodium played in the ecology of different populations, the niches, different niche populations in West Africa. A Medline search of every article that had ever been published on AMKD in blacks asserted that the G1 and G2 APOL1 variants function solely as a natural immunity to trypanosomiasis. And what that means is trypanosomiasis is African sleeping sickness. See, the problem is that when researchers lack precision, and here 21st century precision medicine, when they lack precision, they will put things together that are not necessarily linked. And the all of West Africa is in the tsetse belt, you know, those little tsetse flies and whatever, and they cause trypanosomiasis. But see, what that means is that whether you're from the coast or whether you're from the interior, you will have a natural immunity, some level of natural immunity to trypanosomiasis. And so they thought, because they weren't differentiating where the G1 and G2 were, they simply thought, oh, well, this is about trypanosomiasis. The only problem is they couldn't for the life of them figure out what African sleeping sickness had to do with this long list of kidney diseases. But they felt that sooner or later it would all become clear. But all that really became clear is that G1 and G2 and they could have something to do with trypanosomiasis, but what they really, really, 99% have something to do with is allowing certain populations to live in a salt-free, low-sodium environment because coastal West Africans could not move to the interior. I mean, they wouldn't want to because these were decentralized societies, people engaged in subsistence agriculture, and the coastal areas during the slave period had developed into highly militarized states. And they were therefore preying on these people because they were vulnerable. But the point is, coastal Africans couldn't live there anyhow. Now, the problem is you can go there now and anybody can live anywhere. And you can go to the store in wherever you are in the interior of West Africa and buy Morton salt or whatever. And so it wouldn't occur to you that this was an issue of such absolute primary importance. Okay. Um, so, okay. So why should this seemingly minor genetic data be taken seriously? It's because it's not really minor. And see, now that we can focus attention. You go back, and it turns out that in 2010, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, um, they actually issued a addendum, in a sense, saying that African Americans should reduce their sodium intake to 1,500 milligrams a day, that they were an at-risk group, and so forth and so on. But the problem is nobody paid any attention to it whatsoever. Okay. Um, I'm just listing here some of the sodium reduction protocols. As I mentioned, I mean, honestly, I eat very, very, very little sodium, but it's taken a struggle. Yeah, it's been a struggle. But people can reduce their sodium, and some people are they have digestive problems with monosodium glutamate, which is MSG. But MSG, it's a flavor enhancer, and it's not at all the same as salt, but it can be used sometimes. And then there are these other salt substitutes that, people can use if they're trying to seriously reduce their sodium intake. The problem, though, is that American food is ultra processed and everything has so much sodium that it's hard if you're working all day to find time to be making your own stuff. It's hard. It really is hard. Now, for people who are diagnosed with hypertension, in almost all cases, if you're African American of slave descent, it's going to be salt sensitive hypertension. Hypertension that is identified by by eating a certain amount of salt and your blood pressure just kind of zips up. But there's something fortunate, and that is the fact that at least there are some uh, pharmaceutical, what do you call it? Drugs. There's some drugs for salt sensitive hypertension. But my point is that people take these things for granted. It's like, oh, yeah, I have high blood pressure, whatever. Yeah. But if you're Black and you have high blood pressure, no, it's not a conversation piece. It's a call to action that you really have to do something about it. And so I am just giving you a list of some of the uh, pharmacological possibilities. Okay, and let me just move on quickly to case B, Black female victims of triple negative breast cancer. See, because we're talking about different kinds of diseases, but we're talking about the exact same paradigm. It turns out that there's so little known about APOL1, there's even less known in the medical literature about the A variant of the TRPV6 gene. So the A variant is African, meaning that it'll be found in certain African populations. Okay, the TRPV6A variant is highly absorptive of calcium. It's highly absorptive of calcium. And the reality is that we can, especially within the research I do, we can identify areas of possible prevention when we look at paradoxes. So the paradox here is the fact that 75% of African Americans are lactose intolerant. And at the same time, African Americans have a very low rate of osteoporosis, and we tend to have very strong bone mineral density. We don't easily get our bones broken, so forth and so on, which means that our bones are calcium rich. But see, what is really going on is the fact that it's the A variant of the TRPV6 gene that is so much more absorptive of calcium that therefore African Americans who are not even drinking milk, but they're getting enough calcium, they're getting all the calcium they need. That's the point. They're getting all the calcium they need. Okay, so here we have this calcium paradox. And the point of identifying the paradox is recognizing, oh, if African Americans are getting all the calcium they need, but it's at a much lower level of dietary intake than whites and possibly other populations, what does it mean to get to have a dietary intake of what is considered in America to be normal calcium levels that are actually high for African Americans who have TRPV6A? So we have the fact that Black women have a low risk of osteoporosis, while they're perceived of as being calcium deficient by white standards. But here we end up having a really serious issue that is not being looked at. That is the fact that triple negative breast cancer, triple negative breast cancer, it's triggered by the TRPV6A gene. It's triggered by that gene. And yet there's no research up until now on the connection between calcium intake and triple negative. And the reason there isn't is because calcium intake in females is considered to be almost a sacred issue, because white females have to have, not, in some cases, supplemental calcium in order not to get osteoporosis. But there's no research looking at, well, what happens to populations who do not need, not only do they not need supplemental calcium, but they don't even need as much calcium as is generally the societal intake. And it just so happens that calcium is one of the most reactive minerals in the human body, and it causes certain cancers. It causes metastatic prostate cancer. It causes triple negative breast cancer. Yeah. And so what oftentimes happens is that we have a situation where any American female is told that they should supplement their calcium so they're not getting osteoporosis, with no focus being made on what it might mean to Black women who might in fact be getting a surfeit of calcium. So these are the two case studies that I've used to identify the absolute fundamental importance of knowing these gene variants and so forth. So let me just ask in conclusion, what percentage of African Americans have been made aware of the fact that their susceptibility to fatal sodium and calcium triggered diseases is dramatically higher than that of other groups? And the conclusion I reached was that no, there really hasn't been any conversation, any discussion. In fact, research done on these kinds of issues, because it separates out African Americans of slave descent from various other American populations. But yet, what we're looking at are issues for which prevention can be so easy relative to trying to find a cure for which no cure has yet been found. Okay, so in closing, this is the challenge I bring to you as members of the public health community. There, it becomes of critical importance that we begin to look more locally in terms of localized populations. And we recognize the fact that just calling for diversity is not going to work all that well in the 21st century, when what we really need to call for is stratification of populations. Stratification of populations, if what we're working on is trying to find the link between certain gene variants and particular diseases. Let me also say that Blacks of slave descent carry some of the most precious gifts that nature can confer because it is the attunement of their bodies to the unique factors within the actual ecologies that their ancestors have lived in. And so this becomes critical. And these are ancestral gifts. We're not talking about, oh dear, Black people, we're just in bad shape. We're sick about, we're getting sick for this reason or that reason. Because what we're looking at are people with super kidneys, and they don't need that much salt, and people with powerful bones, and they don't need that much calcium, and so forth and so on. So uh, let me just thank Doctors Nanuel Matthews and Dr. Titlayo Okuror for extending this invitation to me, and I thank all of you for your patience in listening to what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Dr. Hilliard, for that wonderful and very informative talk. I would remind all of our participants and guests that you can put your Q&A in the chat or in the Q&A box rather, and I think it's also possible for you to raise your hand, but if that's disabled for you, just put your Q&A, your question in the Q&A box, and I will try to moderate them for our presenter, our speaker. Dr. Hilliard, I'm going to take my moderator's privilege and ask if you might take some time and talk to us a little bit about what's the history of why the human genome is so skewed and so Eurocentric, um, so that we can understand better the nature of that issue. When all of this mapping was happening, what is it about the mapping, the way that sampling was done, that led to the human genome, the mapping of it that we have being so skewed towards Europe descended population?
Yeah. Oh, well. Well, I mean that is a really critical issue, and I've given a lot of thought to it myself. And so let me just share with you my thinking on the matter. Um, when we look at the history of medicine and say the history of medicine and race, what we have found over and over and over again is the use of Black bodies for racial experimentation. And it's a very ugly history. And I won't even go into detail about Tuskegee and various other really kind of reprehensible things. Okay. But now here is my point. That was the 20th century. In the 21st century, we're living in a different paradigm. And what I mean by that is that gene variants found in non-European populations are contaminants. It's not as though there is a need for bodies, there is, and the point is that when scientists are looking to try to figure out if a particular gene variant is in some way related to a particular set of disease vectors and so forth, the only way they can find them is if they separate out all the gene variants that are different from the gene variants within the population that is being studied. So I feel as though there's been no conversation about this really critical issue because people are still talking about diversity and not genetic diversity, but diversity in terms of, oh, do you have enough African Americans in the sample? Or whatever group, but here I'm talking about African Americans. The problem is that if when there are African Americans in the sample, if the underlying goal is to find the connection's only going to be found for what the majority population has in relationship to the variants. Hopefully that makes sense. So the African Americans in the sample, they're contaminants. Unless you separate out the African Americans of slave descent or separate out whatever populations you genuinely want to find the connection to in terms of gene variants, you have to separate them out. And this is what I mean by stratification. So, my point is that we've sort of been deceiving ourselves by allowing the 20th century to intrude into 21st century precision medicine. And I don't know if that helps at all in terms of your question. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. We have some questions in the Q&A box. Um, there's several questions related to curiosity about research of a similar nature to what you've undertaken for Afro-Latino, South American, and Caribbean populations.
Hmm.
I wondered if you want to say a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. What we do is, or what we really need to do in this case, is identify populations in terms of the ancestral niche they came from. Now, populations can also be mixed. That's why I had my little arithmetic formula in terms of if you're 50% this or 50% that. That doesn't mean you have 50% of this DNA and 50% of some other. It simply means that if you're sick, then it'll be useful to recognize what you might have, what variants you might have, and then it could be found. But if you're well, it doesn't make any difference because just because you're 50-50 for, Northern European, African American, that isn't to say that everything is distributed by, 50-50. But if you're not well, you will be very blessed to find out that, oh, I have BRCA cancer as opposed to triple negative cancer and so forth. Whereas if you have no West African origins, nobody has to even look for a TRPV6A, that sort of thing. So my point is that we use words in a very generalized way, which is fine. But when we're trying to get down to the bricks and mortar of finding specific disease susceptibilities, it's at that point where it becomes important to identify localized populations who share the same ecological niche and who have shared the same ecological niche. Because if there's something unique about that niche that other populations may not have, that's where you're going to look for gene variants that are causing those particular illnesses that may not have a high susceptibility amongst other kinds of populations. So the point is that using localized populations works for everybody, whether you're Asian or whatever, or Caribbean and so forth. But the critical point is you have to know the history of that population. You have to know their migratory patterns. You have to know who they've interacted with and so forth. And those are historical issues. They're not medical issues because medically speaking, those kinds of researchers are not going to be aware of it. Mm.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, there is another question here from Kelly on, who asks, are there other cancers that the TRPV6A gene variant will make you susceptible to?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the issues that really surprised me in a negative way was the fact that I had found European studies that identify this and use a certain category called TRPV6 expressing cancers, but unfortunately, I couldn't find it anywhere in the American medical literature. It was in several research journals in European countries. But for instance, triple negative breast cancer is a TRPV6 cancer. Metastatic prostate cancer is a TRPV6 cancer. Colorectal cancer is a TRPV6 cancer, and there may be one or two others for which the actual examination of the mutating proteins and so forth will be TRPV6. And I, I emphasize that because I think it's unfair to people who have these diseases when, and particularly I'm talking about, say, females with various forms of breast cancer, in situations where the breast cancer is identified as TRPV6, but the only research that's being done is on BRCA. And I think this is what has to change. And I think one of the reasons it's been so slow to change is that sometimes in areas of African studies, Africana studies, and so forth and so on, we sort of back away from the term genetics or genomics because eugenics is so ugly. It's like, you don't want to think about genes and so forth. But in the 21st century, we have to think about genes and obviously get rid of this ugly business of eugenics. And so, oh, well, the problem now is that geneticists did not realize that Africans had all the gene variants. And so there's a kind of hesitancy, in a sense, to really grapple with the meaning of that.
Mm.
Because what does that mean? It means that if we have a new pandemic and I'll just say this crudely, Americans are dropping dead and Chinese are dropping dead and Europeans are dropping dead and so forth and so on. Either a natural immunity will be found somewhere on the African continent or all humans will be dropping dead. And this is a fundamental point. It's like there are natural immunities on the African continent, but we still have this sort of mental block whereby people think, oh, Africans, their gene variants must be primitive or something. No, their gene variants are fundamental and ancestral, and they may keep us alive.
Mm. Um, on that note, I remember something from I think it's chapter 3 of your book where you're discussing this, where you're in a way exploring or suggesting that some of the nutritional guidelines around calcium in terms of daily consumption
Mm.
may be maladaptive in populations with this TRPV6A gene variant. And so
Oh,
Kelly also asks
mhm.
a question about this with because you also discuss in that chapter lactose intolerance.
Absolutely.
Um, she says a large percentage of the Asian population is also lactose intolerant. Do they face this same calcium paradox or no?
Oh, okay. To be candid, I just haven't done the research on Asian populations, so I'm just not altogether sure. But one thing I am sure of is that the only knowledge we have at this point is on Europeans, and the and one thing I realize is that if your background is Chinese or Japanese or from Thailand or whatever, seriously speaking, those countries have highly developed scientific sectors and so forth, and medical sectors, and they will know more about what is healthy for you than anything you will find in the United States, because it'll be in America, it'll be not just overgeneralized, but it'll be normalized for Northern Europeans. So I absolutely cannot say, but one thing I can say is that we need we the American medical and research and public health communities need to reach out to other countries where the populations are themselves more homogeneous, because it's the homogeneity that defines whether or not you're going to figure out how much milk you should be drinking or whatever. But let me say something really quickly about lactose intolerance. Now it's referred to as lactase non-persistence as a way of trying to get away from the pathological presentation, because it just so happens that those populations that were exposed to cattle and therefore into milk and so forth over 10,000 years have variants, the variants that allow them to process lactose. But those population, okay, so now I'll talk about Africans because I know much more specifically. In West Africa, for instance, in terms of lactose tolerance, the ability to drink milk, it's less than 1%. African Americans, it's 25%, because African Americans are generally 75%, 25%. Okay. But the point is that there's a difference between being of Northern European ancestry and you're lactose intolerant, because it probably means there's something wrong and you really need more calcium and you're not going to get it. So the doctors need to do something. But that's a totally different category from populations that are lactose intolerant. West Africans are lactose intolerant. If you go to West Africa and you even meet up with medical doctors, many of them have never even heard of osteoporosis. It's not a factor. They have very strong bones. They drink no milk except their mother's milk. And it's, well, kind of funny because I used to live in Dakar, and it's like kids would be 3 or 4 years old and they still be getting their mother's milk, which was sweet. Okay. But after that, there's no more milk ever for the rest of their lives and so forth. And they have very strong bones, and nobody's ever heard of osteoporosis. So the point I'm simply making is that it needs to be defined by population in terms of whether it's a sickness or whether it's neutral. Uh, and of course, the other problem is Black women in America. We're told as we get older by but most doctors, that we have to supplement our diet with calcium because otherwise we're going to get osteoporosis. But if you're from a population that is at very low risk of osteoporosis, and you keep supplementing your diet, it is creating the possibility that that calcium could trigger one of these TRPV6 cancers.
Um,
Whoops.
we have some additional questions. We have Ibrahim Berry, who asks, how do I know about if I have some of these gene variants? Is there a way to get tested?
Well, that's a really good question. In America, there's a way to do anything if you have enough money. I mean, the issue is whether it's a common test, a common type of test or whatever. From what I've seen thus far, these tests are not common. But I will tell you, you don't necessarily need to get tested, because you can listen to your own body. If, for instance, you're lactose intolerant and uh, your ancestors were from West Africa, but they were your immediate ancestors were slaves and so forth. Take it from me, you are a member of a population that does not need to be drinking milk after your teen years or after your or whatever it is when you stop uh, being able to digest the lactose. So my point is that it's not that we automatically need to be tested for all of these things.
Mm,
It's just that once we understand our lineage, then if we end up having certain kinds of symptoms, we can be tested, but the symptoms are going to tell us what we need to know. It's not as though if you're just a healthy person, you need to go get all kinds of tests and that sort of thing.
mm. Another question asks about gene variations in East African populations, whether or not, for instance, I guess what you've been talking about today, the APOL1 gene and the TRPV6A gene variants are also present in East Africans.
Yeah. Uh, as far as I know, they're not. And see, this is the other point of not using race, but using niche populations or localized populations, because East Africans and Southern Africans consume significant amounts of milk. They're cattle rearing people. And in West Africa, there are no cattle because of the tsetse fly. So in West Africa, people are not going to be drinking dairy. I mean, except modern people, they'll try to do anything. But in terms of our ancestral background, but what in fact triggered some of this research for me was finding out that osteoporosis is a very serious problem in Kenya. And here it's unknown in West Africa. It's a serious problem in Kenya because it is a milk drinking area, which would alert me to the fact that, oh, well, these populations probably don't have the A variant of TRPV6, they would have other variants. And these populations have variants that allow them to process lactose. And what is especially interesting, because I talk about genetic diversity, is that most Europeans have the same LCT gene variant that allows them to drink milk. Whereas once you get to West Africa, you have a whole bunch of different gene variants, different in Kenyans and in the Sudanese and in people from Botswana and all over the place and so forth. So no, you can't just glob all say black people together. It doesn't work that way anymore.
Hmm. Thank you for that question, Hamula. And LaShawn Taylor says, hello from Ohio. Thank you for this information. I was diagnosed with APOL1 and had a kidney transplant because I was in end stage. Can it activate again after a transplant?
As far as I know, no, but I think the primary issue is to be very, very careful with your diet. Yeah, to be very careful with your diet because um, I have no expert on kidney transplants, on the process. But if your kidney is from an interior West African, it's going to be sodium sensitive. If it's from anybody else, it may not be at all. But to be on the safe side, you want to be very, very careful about your your sodium intake. Yeah.
Let's see. There's a question I'm about a westernization in healthcare, I guess Western bias in healthcare.
Hmm.
Nelia Francis is wondering some of the ways we can combat the issue of westernization of healthcare as public health students. Um,
Hmm. Wow. Well, this is very exciting. You're the new generation. You're gonna have to figure it out for the rest of us because um to to some degree American health is oftentimes so focused on well, I don't know how to put this, but money. And so what happens is that there are so many elements of wisdom and knowledge in other societies. And we have to find those and and research them when we can, as opposed to assume that if someone doesn't have a PhD, what they have to offer is hogwash. That's not true. I mean, the pharmaceutical companies we have, they stole all kinds of fundamental knowledge from indigenous populations and so forth. So I think that we have to open our minds to look everywhere and not be surprised at all the real gems we're going to be able to find. But at the same time, you have to figure out, well, how can I prove this? And then even when you can prove it, you're going to have to be strong because if the proof means, you just have to stop doing a little something as opposed to getting millions of dollars in research or whatever, you may not be listened to at first, but you'll be listened to eventually.
There's a question here about from Maxwell Suskind. How would you like to see medical research adapt to better address genetic diversity rather than the more common definition of diversity? I think you
Oh, okay. Yeah,
partially
and
answered this, but maybe you could say a little more.
yeah. It's such an important question, and the answer is really relatively easy. I think medical research will have to begin using stratification models as opposed to diversity models. And what I mean by that is that at this point, diversity models, they're not talking about genetic diversity. They're talking about making sure that they can show that various elements of the American public have been represented. But but that doesn't accomplish much. It really doesn't accomplish because what ends up happening is that if, and as the case may be, the studies, or I'm sorry, a better way to put it is the studies will make breakthroughs for people of Northern European ancestry and for nobody else. Okay. And that's because they will be 90% of it, of the whole thing. And you can't just say, oh, well, let's focus on the 10%. No, you have to have studies for each of these populations so that you can identify, because that's the hard part, the functionality of the gene variants. It's like what gene variant is causing these symptoms. And if you have a diversity of populations in there, you're not going to be able to figure it out until you toss out all the ones other than the one that you're really going to examine. Mhm.
Does this have implications then for training people in public health and how medical practitioners are trained? Does there need to be more sensitivity in medical curriculums to the implications of the stratification of populations and the importance of these ecological niches
Yeah.
for understanding health outcomes?
Yeah. I really think there has to be more of an understanding, but at the same time, I'm a little bit hesitant because racism is real, and racism isn't about stratifying localized populations. It's about all of us. And so I'm not suggesting that we ignore race. I'm simply saying that when we have to be more specific and in some ways more subtle so that if we're dealing with actual genomic research, then we have to flip the script to focus on stratifying localized populations. But that doesn't mean we therefore ignore race and become even more discriminatory against, blacks or whatever other group. And I may not be clear in what I'm saying, but it's simply that uh, race is meaningful, and it's meaningful in cultural ways, it's meaningful in so many other ways. The only situation that I can think of where it's not meaningful is when it comes to precision medicine.
Hmm. Hmm. Check the chat here. Um, make sure I didn't miss anything. Uh, okay. Are there any other questions for our speaker today? Um, well, if there are, put them in the chat. You can also note Dr. Hilliard's email there,
Mhm.
constance.hilliard@unt.edu. Dr. Hilliard, we do have a few minutes left, so
Okay.
I wanted to ask you if you would just say a little bit about um, your book is interwoven with all of these stories that took you down this path of exploring this as a historian. And I think it's tremendously valuable. Can you say a little bit about what the kinds of things that brought you to this study, both
Absolutely.
personal experiences as well as
Yeah.
your interests as a scholar?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Um, huh. Uh, about 15 years ago, I had a Fulbright visiting professorship in Japan, and I was teaching history, African American history, and African history, actually. And Japan has a really fabulous medical system. And so, about 2 weeks before my Fulbright uh, fellowship was over, I decided, oh, I'm going to go get a medical exam and get a checkup and so forth and so on. And you get a full medical checkup and blood work and all kinds of things and whatever, and it costs about $15. So it was like, yeah, I can't beat that. Okay, so I went and got the checkup, but then I was called back a few days later, and essentially, the doctor told me that I had kidney failure. And I was really shocked because yeah, okay. And then he said, because I'm going back to Texas in 2 weeks, he wasn't going to do anything essentially, but he wanted to make sure that I understood how serious it was, and I needed to get medical treatment as soon as I got back home. So, so I when I returned to Texas, I went to my primary care physician and I told him I had kidney disease. And he just looked at me and he laughed. And I thought, that's not a good bedside manner, to say the least. But then he showed me the lab form, and the lab form had African American checked off. Now, that really confused me because here I had spent my whole career helping students to understand that race is a construct, meaning that we create these categories to fit within whatever our exploitative or historical circumstances are. And so here I had this doctor who was saying, oh, yeah, look, I checked off African Americans, so that fixes it because no, there's nothing wrong with your kidneys. Okay, so I was totally confused and I mean, and relieved that I didn't have the disease, but very confused because here I had devoted my career to explaining race, and then it was like all a big mush. And I woke up one morning, it was like, I don't know, a month or two later, and all of a sudden I understood everything. And the epiphany I had had related to the fact that when I started Harvard, and this was in 1967, I was really interested in studying Africa because I wanted to know about my ancestors. But in 1967, there was no American university at all that taught African American history. And so I had an Ethiopian friend who said, "Oh, well, yeah, there's no African history, but study Arabic because there's a rich tradition in Arabic that relates to the interior of West Africa." Well, I did study Arabic, and I spent many years and translating manuscripts from Timbuktu and the other areas of the interior of West Africa that were Islamic. Well, yeah, what does this have to do with the thing that, the misdiagnosis in Japan? It has everything to do with it because what made those states so wealthy was what was known as the gold salt trade. They were trading gold for salt, pound for pound. But the goal was not coming from these empires. The goal was coming from the decentralized societies outside the empires. Those were my ancestors. And they were trading their gold for salt because salt was so rare. And in fact, even the ones who were trading it, it was like more of the kind of elite and so forth, but they weren't even eating it. It was rock salt, and they were using it to sort of as decorations and so forth because it was a precious commodity. And so then I thought, oh, my ancestors saw salt as a precious commodity. And eventually the gold ran out. And when the gold ran out in West Africa, slaves became known as black gold. That was the history of African Americans of slave descent. And then our ancestors were marched to the coast. But then when I started looking at the medical literature, I realized nobody made any reference to this because they didn't know anything about the history of West Africa. And so, in terms of Japan, Japanese people are extremely healthy. They really are extremely healthy. But they're eating 10,000 milligrams of sodium per day. My ancestors were eating 200 to 500 milligrams of sodium. So, if I'm in Japan taking a lab test, it's going to be calibrated according to the Japanese norm.
Mm.
And so that's it. Yeah.
Related to that, there is an additional question here. On an ancestry test, what specific regions in within Africa, I think the Mr. Patrick Barry means,
Mhm.
what specific regions can we attribute this salt sensitivity? So I think he's asking about
Wow.
regions
You
within
know
Africa.
what? Listen, I mean, it's a wonderful question, but I'm sorry to tell you that it's not going to be on the ancestry test. And the reason it won't be is because what the understanding is very confused now because, for instance, you have a country like Ghana, and you have all the countries of West Africa, but see these boundaries are extremely new. They're 20th century boundaries. So you do an ancestry test and it says, oh, your ancestors are this group and that group, and Ashanti and Yoruba and Ibibio and whatever and so forth and so on. But the reality is that you can have the same ethnic population living on the coast, and then you have people speaking the same language living within the interior. And so they're not different. And so my simple point is that they're not differentiated. They really aren't. And so you're going to have to use another means. And the other means is, finding out whether at least the African part of your ancestors were slaves, or whether they're recent immigrants. But see, recent immigrants from West Africa, for instance, in almost all cases, will come from coastal areas, from coastal cities, because those were the cities that were colonized, people are more westernized, and so forth and so on. Yeah.
Fascinating. Um, Yeah, you have given us a lot to think about, and I think sort of alerted us to a major issue. I think that's going to be of great interest in the 21st century as precision medicine ramps up, and you talk about in the book these boutique kind of gene treatments. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate all that you've shared with us today, and we had a fantastic turnout. Um, so I want to thank everyone for coming, our students, faculty, and I want to thank you again, Dr. Hilliard, for sharing your knowledge with us today.
The
It's truly
pleasure
been a
was all
privilege. Yes.
mine. This was very exciting for me. I really appreciated the questions. All of them were just so on target.
And get a hold of Ancestral Genomics. It actually is available online through the Binghamton Library, which is how I've been reading it. So take advantage of that resource and delve in. It's a wonderfully accessible book about a very, very important, complex topic.
Mm.
All right. I will stop recording.